Today at the Literary Kitchen we're talking to Gill Fyffe, who has just today published her first book, which is a memoir called LifeBlood. And Gill, would you like to introduce the novel to us a little bit?
Yes, thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you on the Literary Kitchen. I wrote LifeBlood to celebrate really the courage of my family. It started out as a portrait of a family, of my family, but it could be anybody's family, because what has happened to us over the years has taught me the strength of family ties. And so an unusual thing happened to us. I was given a contaminated blood transfusion, and LifeBlood is a story of how we dealt with that over the following quarter of a century.
Okay, so the book is essentially a family story, and of course at the heart of any family life is food, is eating together. So maybe because of the interests of the people who read this blog, you can tell us a little bit about the food that turns up in the novel. Or in the memoir, sorry.
Yes. Well, it is written as a sort of fairy story, and partly because life turned into a slightly bizarre fairy story. So once we discovered what had happened, it altered our lives completely, and we tried to stay in control of that. And we also dressed up. We imagined that what we were eating was grander than it was. So, for example, when we ate cheese on toast, that was cheese on toast. But if we put a slice of tomato beneath the cheese before we toasted it, that was pizza. And it was quite a while before Rory and Lucy came home and reported this was not pizza. They'd had pizza at their friends' houses. This was altogether different. This is what happens when your children grow up. But what we did find, particularly when we moved into the cottage in Dunedin, where much of the book is set, and which we regard as our home even today, though we're living in London now, what we did find was great friendship. The people who lived in and around Dunedin were hugely supportive of the situation that we were in, and they were very fun, idiosyncratic, serious-minded. They didn't realise they were fun, but they were a lot of fun. Friends. Our great friends were a weaver and her husband. She was an artist, and they came with us on our camping holidays when I was ill and had to inject myself with interferon, which made me feel quite ill.
And that's the drug that's used to treat hepatitis, which is what you'd contracted.
Which is what I contracted, that's right. The transfusion was contaminated with hepatitis C. So when I was receiving treatment for that, but we wanted the children still to have a family life, so I would take the injection, and then we would pile everything into the car and drive north to Rannoch, which is a beautiful loch, almost in the centre of Scotland. It borders Rannoch Moor, which is one of the great wildernesses of Scotland. There are no roads across Rannoch Moor. And we went to a campsite there called Kilfrecht, and I would go to bed in the tent, and the children would play. And we took our friends to camp. We took many friends to camp with us at Rannoch. The wonderful thing about Rannoch was that there was an old shooting lodge on the north side of the loch, which had been bought by the Ludwig family from Germany, and they had turned it into a hotel. And they had a beautiful terrace, a grassy terrace, where you could go to drink coffee and eat German baking, and things like, there was a beautiful chocolate torte, I remember, but my favourite was their apple cake. And
this is quite significant. There's a significant scene in which this apple cake features, isn't there?
Yes, the scene with the apple cake, I think it resonated for me because in the cottage in Dunedin we had apple trees in the garden. So when we were at the shooting lodge in Rannoch, my husband said, would you like some coffee and apple cake? And which was a great treat. And then he told me that if we brought a legal action, it would probably run through the courts for about 10 years, and so we couldn't afford it.
Mm-hmm.
And that the barrister's fee was £1,508. And I was extremely angry because it was going to cost £1,508 to learn that we couldn't do anything. And I said, he might at least have knocked off the 8. And my husband said, yeah, he only charged £1,500. The 8 was for the apple cake to tell you about it. Yeah. So it was a very nice apple cake. It did the trick.
Good. And there's something wonderful about that touch of humour which runs right throughout the novel. I mean, it's not a misery story in any sense. It is told in a very positive and funny way.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Well, that's because I just wrote down what happened, and I never felt, bizarrely, I never felt miserable about it. On 2 occasions I felt absolutely awful, but they were very short. One was when I was waiting for the test result to see if I'd been contaminated, and that was the point when I discovered that you have to stay in control of your life. You can't spend it wishing that something out of your control will go the way you want it to. So whether or not I had been transfused with hepatitis was out of my control at that point. Mm-hmm. And so the only way to go was to decide that if I was, I would cope with it. And as soon as I decided that, and then I was told that, in fact, the test result was positive, I was able to cope with it. And the other occasion was when my treatment failed. I always felt that although the decisions we were forced into making were quite bizarre, they were still our decisions. Mm-hmm. And I had the support of my family and all our friends. So I always felt fairly, I felt optimistic, but I felt that I changed my values. So whether or not I got well became immaterial, because that was out of my control. What mattered was what happened to my children, and I could have an input into that. So once I managed to sort of shift my thinking, then it was a very happy family life. And although I still didn't really have the strength to do much cooking. However,
you mentioned earlier when we were chatting earlier about an inevitable sponge.
Yes,
that's a very interesting name. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes. Well, I called it the birthday sponge or the celebration sponge, and I mean, it's very basic, isn't it? Sponge. It's always about the first page or two of any baking cookbook. So it's what you can manage when you can only actually stay awake for 20 minutes. And so I have to say, I thought it was quite a dab hand at sponges. So they're always very moist, and people liked them. And if you put cream in it, it's really nice.
And so, I'm sure your kids always ate the whole thing.
They always ate, yeah, they did, yeah. So I used to churn them out for birthdays and celebrations. And in fact, there is one mentioned in the memoir when it's towards the end, when my son has grown up and he has a girlfriend and it's their birthday, and he takes her out for her birthday, but I don't realise that in fact although he asked me to iron 2 shirts and asked for a shoe brush, I don't realise that in fact he's about to propose. And so I bake the celebration sponge. But by that point, because it has we've been eating them for about 20 years, it's now referred to in the family on birthdays as the inevitable sponge. Mm-hmm. So, and I've got used to it. I've forgotten what the word inevitable means. To me, it now means the name of a sponge. So I bake the inevitable sponge, and I put a candle on it for my son bringing his girlfriend home, and of course, when she walks in, she is wearing an engagement ring. And I have to say that the inevitable sponge was more often decorated with poached pears than apples, which I was particularly partial to myself. But apples were, when we first found the cottage that we lived in Dunedin, the thing that attracted us to it first was that someone had planted apple trees in the garden. And against all the odds, because the garden was very derelict and it was a fairly windy spot, against all the odds, these trees produced apples year after year after year. And friends of ours had, when they used to invite us over for supper, they had a wonderful recipe for apple crumble, and we could never hope to emulate. But we used to gather up the apples that had fallen and take them. They used to turn them into delicious apple crumble. So in my children's minds, as they grew up, the good things in life were associated with apples. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Gill. That's really interesting, and I do recommend that everybody goes out and buys your book and reads your book because it is fabulous.